Hi, hello, it's Ro. So I've always felt that I was too sensitive. I cry really easily. I feel like lots of things kind of get to me, and I always hated that about myself. I almost wish that I could turn off those emotions. But now becoming a therapist and learning about emotional sensitivity, I've actually completely changed my relationship to my emotions. So if you're someone who's ever been told that you're too sensitive or you're overreactive or you like feel too much or you should just like not care about it, then I hope there's something in this video that's helpful for you. Today I'm going to go through 3 areas. So one, what is emotional sensitivity? And I also go through some metaphors and stuff that I use that I find quite helpful in therapy. And then some kind of common traits will kind of go into the model of the highly sensitive person. And then lastly, we're actually going to go into techniques and what I've found personally really helpful and just ways to kind of cope in the world if you feel like you are more sensitive. Okay, so firstly, what is emotional sensitivity? The way I like to explain it is we all have different types of sensitivity with our 5 senses. So for instance, some people can hear a truck a mile away. Some people are just so sensitive to smell. I can actually smell milk going off like a week before it starts to go off. Some people are very tactile and there are just certain feelings that they really don't like. They're very, very sensitive to. So we kind of understand physical sensitivity in that way. However, there is also emotional sensitivity. So people who can detect feelings in other people, maybe there's this sense of like empathy, people who are picking up on kind of the mood in the environment. And it also talks about our degree of feeling. So people who can feel quite deeply, quite deeply low and also quite deeply high. So an analogy that we use in therapy is think about the cactus, the daffodil, and the orchid. So if you're a cactus type personality, you weather things really well. For cactuses, you can be no water, raining, flooding, heaps of sunshine, doesn't matter, they're pretty sturdy, so they get through everything. Then there's the daffodil, where it's, if there's a lot of stress and it's flooding or something, it will be affected, but generally it's pretty hardy. And then lastly, there's the orchid, which slight temperature change, it dies. Not enough water, too much water, it dies or it wilts. And we think about humans as cactus-like people are ones who don't get too affected by their environment. They kind of cruise through most things and they're pretty resilient. Things don't really get to them, but maybe their emotional range is a little bit lower. They're always just kind of cool and all right and generally very sturdy. Then we've got our daffodil. Most people are kind of in this middle zone where, obviously if something is highly stressful, there's a really big change in our environment, we feel it, but then most of the time get through things pretty well. We can take it in our stride and generally can manage kind of independently or with some friends and stuff like that. Then the orchid type. By far, we see people who I would classify more as orchids in the clinic. And these are people who do actually get quite affected by their environment, by the people around them, by their upbringing, generally are more susceptible to mental health disorders because they just feel more deeply. So there really is this idea of a flip side. So my own therapist was telling me, I was actually talking about a completely unrelated issue about dating, and I think I was complaining about a partner, but she was saying there are certain things in humans that we want to think about flip sides. So for instance, with emotional sensitivity, yes, you're probably more likely to be anxious, more likely to pick up on the feelings around you and not kind of be able to block it out so much, more likely to take on other people's worries or fears, more likely to kind of be in our own heads and be thinking about things, more likely to kind of get burnt out easier. However, the flip side of the coin is that chances are you probably feel joy and happiness and curiosity and all of those things really, really strong as well. And that's the flip side. So generally people who are highly sensitive, when something really touches them, it like really strongly impacts them. When they're happy and feeling good about the world, they really light up a room. And so you think about how with quite low lows, you've sometimes also got these really high highs. And as someone who I remember growing up, I was highly susceptible. I was so anxious, like painfully socially anxious. If I were to reflect back nowadays, I'd say that I probably had separation anxiety, social anxiety, just such a warrior. But I also remember being really easily overwhelmed. So I'd cry a lot and I'd hate myself for it because I'd be really ashamed of the crying. In Asian culture, crying's not exactly smiled upon. And even though my parents were loving and supportive, there still wasn't a sense of like, oh, you're crying, just let it out. It was a bit of like a shameful thing. So I felt very uncomfortable with the fact that I was so reactive. And I would cry not only if something hurt me, I'd cry if I was too angry, which was so annoying in an argument, because imagine halfway through an argument, I just burst into tears. I'd cry if I was overwhelmed, I'd cry if I was tired, I'd cry if I was sad, cried if I was lost. So I genuinely hated that part of myself, and I wished I could be the type of person who could just like stone face someone and like be angry and like seem really strong about it. But there's also the flip side. So sometimes just going out for a walk and seeing the sunlight makes me so happy. And sometimes just seeing like a really nice leaf or tree or something, just like I get so happy about that, and I just get so joyful. And, seeing, elderly people holding hands, or like, a family with a child who's laughing, stuff like that I can also really appreciate. So there's always the flip sides of the coin. And if you feel like, oh gosh, I'm kind of relating to some of the stuff that she's talking about, I want you to think about how, if you are going through a rough time, if you do feel like it can be overwhelming sometimes, there is a flip side. And we do know that often it's the people who are a bit more sensitive. They drift more towards caring roles, but also kind of creative roles. So yeah, that's a bit of an intro to what too sensitive can look like. It can be both a hindrance sometimes, but also a superpower. I want to talk a little bit about the model of highly sensitive people. And there's a lot of research about this from Dr. Elaine Aron. And she developed this model of the highly sensitive person. And there were so many different studies. Some were in like neuroimaging studies, looking at the structure of the brain. Some were looking at in the prevalence of mental health disorders. And so they did kind of built up what this model of a highly sensitive person was. It's essentially what I just described. But what's really interesting is they found there were differences in the brain structure and also activity in like MRI kind of scans. They found that in the amygdala, which is the emotion center, and the insula, which is like the sensory center, there was actually higher activation in people who were like highly sensitive. And it literally means that you are receiving more information. Say, for instance, if we go back to that sound analogy, say, there's an ambulance outside. For most of us, our ears are kind of picking up this much of it, or our insula is picking up this much of it. For someone who is highly sensitive, especially in sound or something, it's almost as like they're hearing this loud of a sound. So you might think about people actually being able to receive more information from the environment, and the brain activity really matches that. So like I said, the different traits also include a higher prevalence of mental ill health. I mean, understandably, if people are more likely to take on their environment, different stresses might become overwhelming if they have an overlap of different risk factors. And just anecdotally in my practice, I've found that people who are neurodivergent, so people on the spectrum or with ADHD, generally tend to have this kind of sensitivity, kind of different profiles. So you'll see that often people who are on the spectrum, they are quite sensory sensitive. So, certain foods will be really tricky to kind of put together. Certain textures really won't fit with them. It's very classic in the profile of autism to be uncomfortable with like tags and certain textures. And then also generally people who are neurodivergent are more emotionally sensitive. They kind of take in more from the environment. And often the issue is that then you can't figure out what to do with it. So we're receiving kind of these cues, but we can't make sense of them. So yeah, there's an interesting kind of link between sensitivity and neurodivergency. However, I'd probably say, like most things, it's probably on a little bit of a spectrum. Like we all have different levels of sensitivity to different things. There's a really interesting video. I'm going to try and find it for you guys and link it in the description thing. It's actually of someone walking through the mall, and I think it's from the perspective of someone who's neurodivergent, and how walking through the mall can feel different if you are highly sensitive. And it's kind of like everything is brighter. When there's different sounds, you can feel like you get so distracted from everywhere. And so that's another way of actually looking at neurodivergence and thinking about how the systems and the structures of the brain are built so that the way that we interact with the world is different. So if you ever feel like, oh gosh, like why am I so weak? Which I definitely did. Why am I so sensitive and soft? Think about how what you're receiving is probably actually different to the experience of someone else that you class as being not sensitive or like strong or something. And because we can't mind read and see what it's like to experience other people's world, sometimes other people can't appreciate that. So I think it's so helpful for me to understand this concept of sensitivity and how sometimes we do just see the world differently, and how you can apply that to give yourself a bit more self-compassion. So quick pause. In 2024, I am setting a goal for myself to upload weekly videos, and the videos have really been about whatever I'm interested in. So please comment below if you're enjoying this type of video, if you have other topics you're interested in, or if you have any questions. I am really experimenting with like what type of stuff to talk about, and sensitivity is one of my kind of interests, and I talk about it a lot in therapy, which is why I'm doing this video today. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, let me know. It's really great to hear from you guys. Third section we're going to talk about is what to do if you feel like you are more sensitive. I want to put down that I think sensitivity and our brain sensitivity to stimuli is kind of a trait that's fairly locked in. Like we're not making massive shifts in it. However, like anything, we are able to increase our resilience and build skills to support that sensitivity. So for instance, if someone has this incredible sensitivity to like mushy foods, often with exposure, that sensitivity can kind of dull a bit, or it can get a bit easier. When we come from this idea of sensitivity, I want you to think about kind of prevention and also recharge. So what I mean by prevention is if you know that socializing or, doing too much stuff is overwhelming, kind of make your calendar one where you set boundaries on your time and your energy, and you put down alone time or recharge time or that kind of thing. For instance, I will only schedule maximum of kind of 2 big social things per weekend. And if I have maybe 2 weekends in a row where I'm quite busy, the third one, I just black out for myself. Like, I know I need that time to recharge. Otherwise, with all of the input from clinic, socializing, going out, doing stuff, YouTube, I am just completely way too overwhelmed. And during those times, I notice that my emotion regulation skills are just completely shot. I can't do it properly. Think about setting up your schedule in a way where go out, challenge yourself, do the exposure, go and be brave. I'm not saying go and sequester yourself in your room. That's a good technique. That's not. We don't live a good life like that. But go out, do the things that give you joy but are tiring, and make sure that you schedule in downtime and like recharge time. The other thing is holding 2 things that are true at once. So 2 things are true. A, you can be highly emotionally sensitive, but B, you can also at the very same time be very resilient. And so if you do get overwhelmed, for instance, when I was so annoyed by this, whenever I'd cry when I was angry, I was trying to like argue with someone. It wasn't a sign that I wasn't able to have that talk. It was just my body just needed to kind of release something. So in that case, it's pause, remind yourself, I'm feeling a lot, but it doesn't mean that I can't get through this. I can cope through hard things. Take a breather and come back to it. Because I don't want sensitivity to kind of be a bit of a crutch where it's like, oh, I'm too sensitive, I can't deal with that. Oh, I'm too sensitive, that's, too much for me. Sensitivity is not an excuse to not engage in life and to not do things fully. It's just that if we know we're sensitive, we're more aware of recharging and setting more boundaries for ourselves. Sensitivity does not mean you're weak, does not mean you're incapable. Go for it. And in fact, over time, we build our resilience to these kind of overwhelming and difficult emotions. Instead of being scared of them, overwhelmed by them, we start having kind of confidence in ourselves and we start building tools around that. And then the third thing is actually, I talked about prevention, is more about setting in environmental kind of protection. So if you know that, this is very common actually for kids on the spectrum, if they're overwhelmed by sound, they bring headphones. If you are overwhelmed by certain tastes, pack a snack pack when you're going somewhere. If you know that certain people are overwhelming, say over the Christmas holidays or something during Lunar New Year, when you've got lots of relatives around you, make sure that you take some time away. Make sure that you, bring a book for a little bit. And again, the idea is not that these are crutches or it's a way of avoiding. When you are taking care of yourself, you're kind of reducing the load and the mental load and the stimuli that you're receiving. It allows you the space and the energy in reserve to go and do what's important to you. We always want to think about like our capacity. We've got a cup of energy, certain things are going to drain the cup. Someone who is highly sensitive, there's just more stuff going on. Their brain is working really hard. They're processing a lot more things. They're trying to regulate a lot harder. The cup will actually drain quicker than maybe other people. And the idea is not that we don't do anything and prevent that. The idea is that we try and do things to recharge the cup. And then we also do things to make sure that we don't reduce the cup and drain ourselves with things that are unnecessary, things that aren't important to us. I think one way to think about it is actually, if you're highly sensitive, it's important to concentrate on what's really important, as opposed to wasting time for things that just aren't that important, but take up a lot of emotional energy. So really streamlining and thinking about what's core and important to you. I hope that was helpful. If you did relate to anything in this video, let me know. It'd be cool to see if there are other sensy people out there. To be completely honest, I think anyone who's studying psychology or wants to be a psychologist probably has some of these traits. Wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if actually a lot of people are highly sensitive, but have just kind of learnt to push it down or to suppress it. I'm super interested to see where this kind of research goes in the future, because this particular body of work was from a little while back. All the best. Thank you for joining in as always. If you'd like to see more, I have videos on different therapy tips and like a playlist. And yeah, I'll see you next Thursday. Bye.